My name is Robert Hale, and this is a story of how a single evening turned my world upside down. For more than 60 years, I believed that love and sacrifice would always come back in the form of respect. I worked every waking hour for my only son, Ethan, so he could have a life far softer than mine. I wanted him to walk through the world without the weight that broke my back. When Ethan was born, I made a silent promise. He would never know hunger or shame or struggle. And for decades, I kept that promise. I worked double shifts at the factory, took weekend jobs repairing roofs and fences, saved every penny I could. I gave him the kind of childhood I had only dreamed of. When he needed tuition, I found a way. When he wanted new shoes, I went without dinner. When he said he wanted a car, I sold my old watch to help him buy one. That's what fathers do, I told myself. They give until it hurts, and then they give some more. I thought one day he would see it. I thought one day when I grew old and tired, he would look at me and say, "Dad, it's your turn to rest." But that day never came. Instead, one night, as we sat at the dinner table, the illusion shattered. It was supposed to be an ordinary meal. His wife had cooked rice and stew. The kids were talking over each other, and I sat quietly at my usual spot, waiting until everyone had served themselves. I had learned to eat last. That's what old men do when they've been reminded enough times that they're guests in their own homes. When I finally asked for a small second helping, Ethan didn't say a word. He picked up his glass of water, leaned forward, and threw it in my face. The cold splash hit harder than any slap. And in that moment, I realized I had raised a man who no longer saw me as his father. When that water hit my face, time froze. The sound of laughter, the clatter of spoons, the smell of food, all of it vanished. I just sat there, drenched and speechless, staring at my son across the table. For a moment, I thought he'd laugh and say it was a joke gone wrong. But his expression stayed hard, cold, and annoyed, as if I had disturbed his peace simply by asking for more food. His wife didn't look shocked. She smirked, almost proud. The children went quiet, their eyes darting between us like they were watching a show. That silence, that cruel, unbroken silence, was louder than any scream. I didn't say a word. I didn't curse, didn't shout, didn't even stand. My hands trembled as I wiped my face with a napkin. I told myself, don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. So I sat there soaked, with my dignity bleeding out quietly across the table. When dinner ended, no one spoke to me. They cleared their plates, laughed again, and moved on like nothing had happened. I stood up slowly, every joint aching, and walked back to my small room at the end of the hallway. The room that used to feel like part of my home, but now felt like a rented corner in a stranger's house. Inside, I sat on the bed and stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. The old man, looking back at me, didn't seem like me anymore. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped. I had spent my life lifting others, and now there was no one left to lift me. I thought about all those years, the nights I skipped meals so Ethan could eat, the winters I worked through fever just to pay his tuition, the times I swallowed pride and pain to keep a roof over his head. I gave him everything, even my self-respect. And for what? To be treated like an inconvenience at my own table? That night, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger yet. What I felt was something worse, a cold, hollow realization that my son no longer saw me as his father. He saw me as a burden. That night, I lay awake on my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The rhythmic sound reminded me of the factory I used to work in, the same place I spent half my life. So Ethan could have more than I ever did. Every hum of those blades took me back to the boy he once was, and how somewhere along the way, that boy disappeared. When Ethan was little, he used to run into my arms the moment I came home. My hands would still be rough from work, the smell of grease and sweat clinging to me. But he didn't care. He'd press his tiny face into my shirt and say, "Dad, you smell like hard work." I used to laugh at that. I thought he understood. I thought I was raising a son who respected effort, not just success. But love can turn blind when it's too generous. Every toy he asked for, I bought. Every whim he had, I fulfilled. When he wanted a gaming console I couldn't afford, I took a loan. When he asked for branded shoes, I lied to my wife and said we needed them for his school activities. Every time I said yes, I thought I was proving my love. But what I was really teaching him was that life would always say yes to him, that his father's sacrifice was endless. The years went by, and that innocent boy who once hugged me started rolling his eyes whenever I spoke. He stopped listening, stopped asking questions. Gratitude turned into expectation. The day I opened a joint account for him, thinking it would help him learn financial responsibility, I signed the beginning of my own downfall. He treated my savings like a buffet, picking what he wanted without ever asking. I ignored it all because I believed that fatherhood meant endurance. But looking back, I realized I wasn't enduring. I was enabling. As the night stretched on, I whispered to myself, where did I go wrong? The truth hit me hard. I had spent a lifetime giving Ethan everything except the one thing he needed most, the understanding that love and respect are not guaranteed. They must be earned. It didn't happen overnight. Disrespect rarely does. It creeps in quietly, disguised as impatience, wrapped in small remarks that sting only after you start collecting them in your heart. At first, it was the way Ethan spoke to me. Short answers. A sigh every time I asked a question. A roll of the eyes when I forgot something. Once, I asked him to help change a light bulb because I couldn't reach it anymore, and he muttered under his breath, "You're really getting useless. Old man. Old man." That's what I had become to him. Not dad. Not father. Just an old man cluttering his house. I tried to tell myself he was just stressed. Maybe work was getting to him. Maybe I was imagining it. So I stayed quiet. That's what I had done my whole life. Fix problems by swallowing them. But soon, the tone became habit. If I coughed too much, his wife, Claire, would complain that I was disturbing the kids. If I sat in the living room for too long, she'd find a reason to turn off the TV and need silence. They made me feel like I was intruding in a home I helped build. I remember one afternoon vividly. I had walked to the pharmacy alone to pick up my medicine. My knees hurt, but I didn't want to bother Ethan. When I got back, limping and sweating, he looked at me and said, "Why didn't you just order online? You like making everything dramatic, don't you?" No concern, no gratitude, just annoyance. It was in moments like that when I realized how invisible I had become. He no longer saw the man who worked 2 jobs to buy him school books. He saw only a tired body taking up space and air. Once, when his children imitated the way I walk, slow, unsteady, Ethan laughed, not out of surprise or embarrassment, but with pride, as if he had trained them to mock me. I smiled faintly to hide the pain. But inside, something cracked that day. Because when a father sees even his grandchildren learning disrespect from their parent, it means the decay has spread too deep. And yet I stayed, still hoping love would return, still believing blood was enough to fix what pride had broken. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that hides storms beneath quiet skies. The clock had just struck 7 when Claire called everyone to dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. Laughter echoed from the kids' room. And for a brief moment, it almost felt like peace. I sat at my usual place, the far end of the table. It wasn't assigned, but it had become my corner. Distant enough not to disturb, close enough to pretend I still belonged. Ethan sat at the head, his phone in one hand, scrolling through something while chewing with the other. His children bickered over who got the bigger piece of bread. I waited until everyone had been served before touching my plate. Old habits. When I finally took my portion, I made sure it was small, just enough to not draw eyes. The meal was pleasant, if silent. No one really spoke to me anymore, unless it was necessary. Halfway through dinner, I finished what I had and still felt a little hungry. My appetite had grown weaker with age. But that night, I simply wanted a bit more. So I looked up and said softly, "Could I have a small serving of rice?" The words barely left my lips before the air shifted. Ethan froze. Slowly, he looked up from his phone with a face full of irritation. "You've had enough," he said, voice sharp. I thought he was joking, so I smiled faintly. "Just a little more, son." And then, without warning, he grabbed his glass and hurled the water across the table. The splash was cold, sudden, merciless. It hit my face, soaked my shirt, ruined the food on my plate. For a few seconds, no one moved. Claire's lips curled into something between shock and amusement. The children stared, their mouths slightly open. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "Stop acting like a king in my house." My throat tightened, but no words came out. The humiliation wasn't just in the act. It was in the silence that followed. No one defended me. No one apologized. The man I had raised with love had just stripped me of my dignity in front of his own family, and they all watched it happen. I didn't speak a word after that. Not when the water dripped from my chin. Not when my food turned to mush on the plate. Not when Claire whispered something smug under her breath. I simply sat there, a statue carved from shame. When dinner ended, I stood up slowly. My chair creaked, and for a brief moment, all eyes turned to me. But I didn't meet their gaze. I just walked away, one trembling step after another, until I reached my small room at the end of the hall. I closed the door quietly behind me. The lock clicked, not in anger, but in surrender. The laughter from the living room seeped through the thin walls, every sound cutting deeper than the last. I sat on the edge of my bed, my shirt still damp and clinging to my skin. It wasn't the water that stung. Water dries. Clothes dry. But dignity, once drenched in humiliation, never dries the same way again. I stared at the mirror above my dresser. The man staring back was a stranger. His eyes were red and tired, his lips trembling from a mix of age and fury. Wrinkles carved deep into his face, each one a scar from a lifetime of sacrifice. For a long time, I just sat there thinking, not about the insult, but about the years that led to it. Every memory hit like a hammer. The times I worked double shifts so Ethan could buy new shoes. The nights I skipped dinner so he'd have enough lunch for school. The mornings I left for work before sunrise while he still slept peacefully. I realized something that night. I hadn't raised a son. I had built a master. I had carved a throne and placed him on it, thinking love would make him kind. But all it made him was entitled. And yet, through all that rage and grief, I didn't shout. I didn't slam doors or cry. I just breathed, slow and steady. Because somewhere deep inside, another feeling began to take root. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was resolve. That silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. I didn't sleep that night. The room was dark except for the thin strip of moonlight creeping through the curtains. My thoughts raced like a film I couldn't pause. Every insult, every moment of mockery played again and again in my head, until suddenly a different thought surfaced. He thinks I'm powerless. That single realization changed everything. Because the truth was, I wasn't. Ethan believed he had taken control of my life. He strutted around like the king of a castle I built, spending money he didn't earn, sitting at a table I paid for, in a house whose foundation I had poured with my own hands. But he had forgotten one thing. The name written on every document, every account, every deed was mine. Years ago, when I opened our joint bank accounts, the clerk had asked, "Mr. Hale, are you sure you want your son to have access?" I had smiled and said, "He's my only child. I trust him." Those words echoed in my mind now, heavy with irony. He had mistaken access for ownership. But I never gave him ownership, not legally, not truly. I still held the rights. I still had the authority. I had simply been too trusting to use it. That night, I got up, opened the old wooden drawer beside my bed, and pulled out a stack of papers I hadn't touched in years. Property deeds, bank statements, investment receipts. Each one had my name printed clearly, Robert Hale, not Ethan, not Claire. As I spread them across my bed, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel helpless. I realized I had built a fortress around my son without even meaning to, and I was still the one holding the keys. While they laughed in the other room, believing the old man had been silenced, I sat in the dark with proof that silence could roar louder than any shout. He had taken my dignity at the dinner table, but I still held his future in my hands. By dawn, my decision had solidified like cooling metal. I sat at the edge of my bed, my fingers tracing the edge of those papers, as if they were a map out of captivity. The night before, humiliation had soaked me to the bone. Now, purpose drive me clean. I wasn't thinking about revenge. Not yet. What I wanted first was peace. A peace that couldn't exist under Ethan's roof. I showered, dressed neatly, and made myself a cup of coffee. My reflection in the kitchen window looked different that morning. Not broken, not defeated. Just still. Claire passed by without a word. Ethan didn't even glance at me before leaving for work. He didn't know that by the time he came home, the ground beneath him would already be shifting. After breakfast, I went back to my room and gathered every financial document I owned. Bank folders, property deeds, pension statements, all neatly stacked in a worn leather case. Each page was a reminder that the old man he mocked still held a pen that could erase his world. I called my longtime banker, Mr. Mason. He had known me for years, watched me deposit my wages one envelope at a time. I spoke calmly, masking the storm underneath. I'd like to review my accounts, I told him, preferably in person. He gave me an appointment that afternoon. The hours before that meeting felt endless. I kept busy, tidying my room, folding clothes, pretending everything was normal. When lunchtime came, Ethan returned home briefly. He laughed with Claire, complained about work, ignored me completely. That only strengthened my resolve. He believed my silence meant surrender. But silence, when held by a thinking man, is not surrender, it's strategy. When I finally stepped out that afternoon, I didn't walk like a defeated father. I walked like a man going to reclaim his name. The air outside felt lighter, the sky clearer. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom. I wasn't sure yet what I would do after I took back control. But I knew one thing for certain. Ethan Hale's empire of arrogance was built on my foundations, and I was ready to pull them out from under him. The bank stood on the corner of Maple Street. Tall glass doors, clean marble floors, and the faint hum of air conditioning. I had walked through those doors countless times in the past, usually tired, usually humble. But that day, I walked in with purpose. Mr. Mason, the branch manager, greeted me with his usual polite smile. "Mr. Hale, good to see you again. How can I help today?" I set the folder on his desk. "I'd like to make some changes," I said, my voice steady, deliberate. "I need every joint account under my name only. No shared access. No secondary card holders." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "All of them?" "Yes." Effective immediately. He hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "Of course, sir. You're the primary holder. That's entirely within your rights." As he began typing, the faint clatter of keys sounded like thunder to me. Each stroke erased a piece of Ethan's false kingdom, one line at a time. While he worked, I sat silently, hands folded, eyes calm. Inside, I felt a strange peace, not triumph, not vengeance, just release. It took nearly 2 hours. Form after form, signature after signature. My name repeated on every page like a quiet declaration. Robert Hale, sole owner. When the last paper slid across the desk, Mr. Mason looked at me. "It's done," he said softly. "Your son's access has been revoked. He no longer has authorization. $3 million. Years of sweat and sacrifice, all safely returned to the hands that earned them." I thanked him, stood, and left without looking back. Outside, the sun was bright, almost blinding. The city noise felt different that day. Every car horn, every footstep sounded like part of rhythm I finally understood. I stopped by a cafe on the way home, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window watching strangers pass by. For the first time in decades, I felt invisible, but in the best way. No one expected anything from me. No one knew what I had just done. Ethan thought I was powerless, but I had just taken back everything he ever called his, and he didn't even know it yet. When I returned home from the bank, the air inside the house felt heavier, maybe because I finally understood that this place was never mine anymore. Ethan was sitting on the couch, laughing at something on his phone, while Claire folded laundry beside him. Neither of them looked up when I walked in. Good. I didn't want them to. I went straight to my room, closed the door, and sat down beside my old leather bag, the same one I'd used years ago when I still traveled for work. I unzipped it slowly, feeling the weight of every quiet decision pressing down on my chest. Then I began to pack. Not much, just what I needed. A few shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, my medicine, my passport, and the folder that held my entire life's work. I left behind everything else. The photos, the furniture, the memories, those things no longer belonged to me. When I finished, I sat on the bed and stared at the walls. Each mark, each nail hole carried a piece of history. Birthdays, laughter, family dinners that used to mean something. But all I felt now was emptiness. I opened my laptop and booked a one-way ticket to another country, a quiet, coastal place I had once read about in a magazine, a place where no one knew the name Ethan Hale. I used a new account, freshly created under a different address. Everything was clean, discreet, final. Then I wrote an email to my lawyer, Mr. Green. I gave him clear instructions. Deliver a sealed envelope to my son 2 weeks after I left. Inside, I placed a single note. No anger, no explanations, just closure. That night, I had dinner alone in my room, a simple sandwich and a cup of tea. From the hallway, I heard laughter from the living room. It didn't bother me. Not anymore. For years, silence had been my cage. But now it was my key. Tomorrow, I would leave before dawn. No goodbyes. No footprints to follow. By the time Ethan realized what I had done, I would already be gone. And so would the life he thought he owned. The world was still dark when I woke. The clock showed 4:37 a.m. I sat up slowly, feeling that strange mix of heaviness and relief that comes before a final goodbye. My bag was ready, leaning quietly against the wall, patient, like it knew what today meant. I moved around the room carefully so no floorboard would creak. I folded the blanket, wiped the dust from the nightstand, and took one last look at the space that had once been mine. It was just a room now, walls without warmth. Outside my window, the street lamps flickered in the mist. The city felt half asleep, unaware that a man was about to vanish from it. I wrote one final note and left it on the desk. It wasn't for Ethan. It was for myself. It said, "You have done enough." Then I picked up my bag, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. Ethan's room was silent. Claire's gentle snore drifted through the half-open door. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to look at him one last time, to remember his face before it hardened into arrogance. But then I thought of the glass of water, the mocking tone, the years of being invisible, and I kept walking. When I reached the front door, I paused. My hand rested on the doorknob longer than it should have. Leaving wasn't easy, even after all the cruelty. A father's love doesn't disappear overnight, but love without respect is just pain with a pretty name. The air outside was cold, sharp, honest. I breathed it in like medicine. I called a cab and stood waiting under the pale streetlight, my breath visible in the air. When the car arrived, I climbed in without looking back. As the driver pulled away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it was just a shadow swallowed by dawn. For the first time in decades, I wasn't running to something. I was running from something. By the time the sun broke through the horizon, I was already at the airport, ticket in hand. The board read, "Departure 7:10." And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. As my plane lifted off the runway, I looked out the window and watched the city shrink beneath the clouds. Somewhere down there, Ethan was still asleep, dreaming of control, believing the world revolved around him. He had no idea that in a few hours, his entire illusion would crack open like glass. I imagined the scene not out of joy, but clarity. I knew my son well enough to picture it perfectly. He would wake late, stretch lazily, and wander into the kitchen asking for coffee. Claire would be scrolling through her phone, the children still in their pajamas. He'd talk about errands, bills, maybe brag about some deal at work. Then he'd reach for his wallet, take out his card, and tell Claire, "Don't worry, I'll pay that later." And that's when it would begin. First, the frown, small, impatient, when the bank app showed an error. Then the frustration, the tapping fingers, the second try, and then the silence, heavier than any shout. When he realized the message was real, account not found, he'd try another card. Declined. Another. Declined again. The illusion of wealth would crumble faster than he could reload the page. I could almost hear his voice rising with anger and panic. He'd call the bank, and Mr. Mason, ever polite, would explain what I already knew. Your father has removed your name from all accounts. You no longer have access. Maybe he'd shout. Maybe he'd laugh in disbelief. But nothing he said would matter. The system doesn't care for arrogance, only signatures. By the time he realized I was gone, I'd already be thousands of feet in the air, leaving behind everything but my peace. I didn't smile thinking of his panic. I didn't hate him. I just felt done. For years, I had carried his world on my shoulders. That morning, I finally set it down. He would wait to find his father gone, his money gone, his safety gone. And for the first time in his life, he'd have to stand on his own feet, the same way I once did, with nothing but his name. By the time my plane touched down, my phone was already buzzing nonstop. Dozens of missed calls. Messages pouring in one after another, all from Ethan. At first, the words were sharp, angry. What did you do? You can't just take my money. Call me back right now. I watched the notifications roll across the screen, one after another, but I didn't open a single one. I turned the phone face down on the tray table and stared out the window instead. Outside, the ocean shimmered beneath the sunlight, calm and endless, the opposite of the storm raging in my son's house. When I landed, I turned on my phone again out of curiosity. His tone had changed. The anger was cracking into fear. Dad, please call me. Something's wrong with the bank. They said I don't have access. What's happening? Please, I need to talk to you. Every message arrived like an echo of all the times I had once reached out to him and been ignored. But I didn't feel satisfaction, only stillness, the kind that comes when justice is finally balanced. I switched the phone off and removed the SIM card, dropped it into a trash bin near the taxi stand, and walked away. It was symbolic, cutting the last line that tied me to him. Somewhere, Ethan was pacing through the house, checking every room, opening my closet, realizing my bag was gone. I imagined his face when he found the empty hanger where my jacket used to be, the untouched bed, the quiet. Silence can be the loudest punishment in the world, and I had just given him a lifetime of it. He would call my lawyer next desperate, demanding answers, and my lawyer would say exactly what I'd instructed him to. Your father made his decision. There's nothing left to discuss. That sentence would sting him more than losing the money, because for the first time, Ethan would realize there were consequences for everything he had done, and this time no apology, no pleading, no arrogance could undo it. Days passed before I checked the news from home again. By then, I had already moved into a small apartment in a seaside town, a quiet place where no one knew the name Hale. The air smelled of salt. The streets were narrow and calm, and every morning the sea reminded me that distance can heal wounds no apology ever could. But even far from him, the echoes of Ethan's panic found me. Through friends of friends, I began to hear whispers, stories carried through digital wind. He had gone to the bank, furious and pale, demanding explanations. He shouted in the lobby until the security guard escorted him out. People had seen it. Neighbors whispered. His confidence, his image, his pride, all of it was unraveling in public view. I didn't rejoice. I didn't celebrate. I simply breathed easier. They said Claire stopped defending him. She blamed him for everything. The arguments grew louder, and the laughter that once filled the house turned into cold silence. Even the children began to sense it, that the man who used to mock his father had lost something he couldn't replace. In a way, I had given him the greatest lesson I could. Not through lectures or punishment, but through absence. Here, in my new home, silence finally became peace. I'd wake early, brew my own coffee, and sit on the balcony watching the fishermen return with their catch. The world moved slowly here. No shouting, no judgments, no demands. Just waves and wind. Sometimes I'd think about Ethan, not as the man who humiliated me, but as the boy who once held my hand while crossing the street. I wonder when exactly that child had disappeared. Maybe the moment I gave him everything. Maybe the moment I stopped saying no. I didn't hate him. I didn't even wish him harm. I just wished he had learned the value of what I once gave freely, respect. Because without respect, money turns to dust, and love becomes just another transaction. And now, finally, my silence was teaching him what my words never could. 3 weeks after I left, I received an email from my lawyer, Mr. Green. The subject line was simple: letter delivered. I didn't open it right away. I sat by the window, watching waves break against the rocks, the sound soft and steady, the sound of closure. I had written that letter on my last night, before leaving. Just 2 sentences, nothing more. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want guilt or forgiveness. I wanted truth, clean, final, and unforgettable. Mr. Green had promised to deliver by hand, only when the chaos had settled enough for silence to sting. And so he did. I could almost picture the moment. Ethan sitting in the living room, surrounded by unpaid bills and quiet resentment. Claire likely distant, the children unsure. The doorbell rings. A man in a gray suit stands there holding an envelope. "It's from your father," Mr. Green would have said. I imagine Ethan taking it with shaking hands, confusion flickering across his face. Maybe he hoped it was an apology. Maybe he thought I'd written to forgive him. But when he tore it open, he would have found only this: "You threw water on my face. I drained the life you thought was yours." No signature. No return address. Nothing else. I didn't need to say more. The silence between those 2 sentences held everything. The years of sacrifice, the night of humiliation, and the justice that followed. Mr. Green told me later that Ethan just sat there for a long time, staring at the paper. His wife read it, said nothing, and walked away. The children kept their distance. For the first time in his life, Ethan had no one left to command, no one left to blame. I closed the email from my lawyer without replying. There was nothing to add. I poured myself a cup of tea and stepped out onto the balcony. The sea stretched endlessly before me, vast, forgiving, eternal. For the first time in a long, long while, I felt something close to peace. Not revenge, not victory, just peace, the kind that comes when the noise finally stops. The days after the letter felt strangely light, like someone had opened a window in my chest. For years, my heart had carried the weight of disappointment, anger, and unspoken love. Now, the air moved freely again. I settled into my new life quietly. My apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a balcony that overlooked the harbor. I didn't need more. Each morning, I'd wake before sunrise, make black coffee, and walk down to the pier. Fishermen would already be there, pulling in their nets, their laughter echoing through the salty air. None of them knew who I was, and that anonymity was my greatest comfort. I bought a notebook and began writing again, not stories or letters, just thoughts. Sometimes about Ethan, sometimes about life. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud, but peace is silent, and silence had finally chosen me. In the afternoons, I'd sit at a small cafe near the beach. The owner, a kind woman named Lucia, always smiled when she saw me. "You're the quiet man with the faraway eyes," she once said. I smiled back and told her I was just learning how to breathe again. At night, I cooked simple meals. Soup, rice bread. I ate slowly, savoring every bite. No mocking glances, no sighs of irritation, no one counting what I took. Just me, the sound of waves outside, and the feeling of dignity returning to my skin. Sometimes I look out at the horizon and wonder if Ethan ever truly understood why I did what I did. Did he finally see the line between love and servitude? Did he realize that respect is not owed, but earned? Maybe one day he would. Maybe not. It no longer mattered. I had spent my life trying to teach him through giving. My last lesson I taught through absence. The sea has a way of forgiving what people cannot. It erases footprints, carries pain away with every tide. And standing there each evening, with wind against my face and salt on my lips, I finally understood something simple yet powerful. Peace doesn't come from being loved. It comes from no longer needing to be. In the quiet rhythm of my new life, I began to understand something I never could in the chaos of my old one. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes dressed as silence. For decades, I believed justice meant fairness. That if you gave love, you'd receive it back. If you work hard, you'd be respected. But life doesn't trade evenly. Sometimes the scales stay tilted until you stop waiting for balance and tip them yourself. Ethan had taken everything intangible from me: respect, peace, dignity, but he never took my power to choose. That was the truth I had forgotten, buried under years of guilt and love. The day he threw water in my face, he thought he had broken me. But that act didn't destroy me. It revealed me. It showed me who I had become. A man living quietly in the shadow of his own sacrifices. Taking back what I built wasn't vengeance. It was reclamation. It was a father reminding himself that even love must have boundaries. Each evening as the sun sank behind the water, I'd sit by the shore and watch the sky change color. Blue to gold, gold to crimson, crimson to darkness. It reminded me that endings aren't always tragic. Sometimes they're just transformations wearing the disguise of loss. I thought often about Ethan's face when he realized everything was gone. I wondered if he understood that the money wasn't the real punishment. The silence was, because silence forces reflection. It strips away excuses. It leaves you alone with truth. Justice, I learned, isn't about watching someone suffer. It's about removing yourself from the reach of their cruelty. It's the peace that follows when you no longer seek approval from the person who hurt you. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need forgiveness. I only needed freedom, and I had finally given to myself. So when the waves whispered at night, I whispered back, "It's done," not with anger, not with triumph, but with understanding. Justice wasn't about making him lose. It was about finally letting myself win. The first few weeks by the sea were quiet, almost too quiet. I had lived so long surrounded by noise, complaints, arguments, demands. That silence felt like a stranger I had to learn to trust. But slowly I did. I began walking every morning along the shore, the sand cool under my feet, the gulls crying overhead. I'd watch the fishermen pull their nets and greet them with a nod. They didn't know who I was or what story I carried. To them, I was just another old man who liked the sea. I liked that. I liked being no one. One afternoon, a small boy dropped his ice cream near the cafe. He looked like he was about to cry. I bought him another one. His mother thanked me with a smile that reminded me of a long-forgotten warmth, the kind that used to live in my home before bitterness replaced it. That moment made me realize something. Peace grows in small acts. You don't have to rebuild an entire life at once. Sometimes it starts with a scoop of ice cream and a stranger's smile. I started volunteering at a nearby library, repairing old books and reading stories to children. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Anna, often said, "You have a calm voice, Mr. Hale. The children listen when you speak." I smiled at that. Once, my voice was only met with sighs and rolling eyes. Now it was met with attention, and that simple respect felt like redemption. At night, I'd write in my notebook, not about anger or regret, but about gratitude for the sea, for the quiet, for the lesson life had carved into me. I wasn't running from my past anymore. I was walking toward a new kind of future, one where I didn't need anyone's approval to feel worthy. Ethan's face still came to me sometimes in dreams, not the angry man from that dinner table, but the little boy with curious eyes who once said, "Dad, I want to be like you." I always woke up with a bittersweet smile. Maybe someday he still would, just not in a way either of us once imagined. As the months passed, I found myself thinking less about what Ethan did to me and more about what I had allowed. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always about saying it's okay. Sometimes it's about finally admitting, I let it happen too long. I had mistaken sacrifice for love. I thought the more I gave, the stronger our bond would be. But real love, especially a father's love, isn't proven by how much you give, but by what you teach through your giving. I had taught Ethan comfort, not character, ease, not empathy. And for that, part of me shared the blame. But guilt, like anger, can only live where peace has not yet moved in. I'd done my best with the tools I had. My mistakes came from love, not malice. And that truth gave me a strange kind of forgiveness, not for Ethan, but for myself. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on my balcony watching the sun melt into the horizon. The sea always looked different, but it never failed to remind me of something my own father once said. You can't guide a man who doesn't want direction. You can only build a path and hope he finds his way back. That's what fatherhood really is. You build, you protect, you hope, and sometimes you let go. I didn't know if Ethan would ever find that path again. Maybe he'd rebuild. Maybe he'd learn humility. Maybe he'd spend his life angry. That part was no longer mine to control. But deep inside, under all the scars and silence, I still wished him well. Because even if a son forgets his father, a father never truly forgets his son. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I didn't need closure from his mouth. I'd already written it with my actions. What mattered now was legacy, not the money I left behind, but the lesson. If one day Ethan looked back and realized what he lost was never money but love, then my silence will have done its work. Until then, I live with the calm certainty of a man who finally understands. A father's duty is to give life, not to lose his own to it. Now, as I sit here watching the evening sky dissolve into the sea, I realize my story isn't about loss. It's about awakening. Life has a way of humbling us, of stripping away illusions until all that's left is truth. Mine came late, but it came clearly. I used to think being a good father meant giving everything. But now I know it means knowing when to stop giving. It means teaching strength, not dependence. Respect, not obedience. And sometimes it means walking away, not in anger, but in dignity. I often imagine Ethan somewhere far away, rebuilding his life from the ashes of his arrogance. I don't know if he still hates me. I don't know if he finally understands. But I hope when he looks in the mirror, he sees not the man who lost money, but the man who lost his father's respect, and realizes which one was truly priceless. If he ever learns that, then all of this, every sleepless night, every scar humiliation, every tear swallowed in silence, will have meant something. The ocean in front of me is endless, and I've started to see my life that way too. It doesn't matter where it began or how it broke. What matters is that it still moves, forward, steady, forgiving. Some evenings, I whisper to the wind, not expecting it to carry my words anywhere. I simply say, I forgive you, Ethan. And maybe, somewhere, those words find him, or maybe they just return to me, softening the last corners of my heart. I'm old now, but I don't feel small anymore. I feel free. Free from needing to be understood, free from begging to be seen. I gave my son everything I could, and in the end, I gave myself back what I'd forgotten, self-respect. If any father hears my story, I'd tell him this. Love your children deeply, but love yourself enough to set boundaries. Teach them kindness, not entitlement. Give them lessons, not just comfort. Because one day, love without respect becomes a cage, and silence, when chosen, becomes freedom. That's all that remains of Robert Hale's story. Not revenge, not regret, just peace.